Hey folks, before we get into this week's topic, I just want to say that if you like this video or you'd like videos like this, the best way to make sure that you see them is to subscribe. YouTube is coming along and age limiting my videos, and some they'll allow and some they won't. I really can't tell the difference. It makes a huge difference in the number of people that actually see these videos. I'll get a few dozen views over a couple of months with some, and then anything that's not age limited will get 20,000 views. And so I want to try to figure it out. I haven't gotten it yet. So at any rate, the best way to keep up is just to hit subscribe. I'm going to keep working through this, and hopefully this stuff is going to be available to the folks who want to see it. All right, well, on with the show. Today, I want to talk a little bit about marijuana and DUI, as in driving under the influence. Now, when I was involved in state-level legalization campaigns, one of the very first arguments I would hear from the prohibitionists, the people opposed to the work we were doing, they would come along and say, if you legalize, that means a lot more people will be consuming. That means they will be consuming and getting behind the wheel. That means the highways are going to be a lot more dangerous. Well, we never reached apocalyptic proportions, but in several cases, lawmakers heard those scary stories and they responded by passing terrible DUI laws. Well, let's take a look. All right, well, today we have a large chunk of states that have DUI laws that are aimed at impairment and trying to keep our roads safe, but which very likely result in situations in which people who are not impaired end up going to jail. And it's very possible that there's even cases where people who shouldn't be driving get away with it. To understand why these DUI laws are so broken, let's take a look at the two kinds of DUI laws that are out there. One is based on impairment, and the other one is called DUI per se. Well, the first kind of DUI is the kind of classic DUI. It's a cop and a suspect, and they're pulled over at the side of the road, and the cop maybe's cleared out an area, and now your suspect is walking the line, or standing on one leg, or performing some kind of physical test. The law enforcement officers observing all of this and trying to use those tests in order to determine whether or not the person's too drunk to drive. Well, there's another kind of DUI, and that's DUI per se. When we're talking about alcohol, you can look at a person's bloodstream and measure how much alcohol is there and make some pretty educated guesses about what's going on inside the person's head. You don't have to be over at the side of the road to perform these tests or walk the line or anything else. You just measure how much alcohol is there, and if you're above a certain line, you're impaired as a matter of law. So whether it's through a breath test where they take a sample of a person's breath, and based on that sample they can tell how much alcohol is actually in the person's bloodstream, or they might even take that person right to the hospital and do a blood draw right there. If they measure those samples and find that the person is above the limit, then they are impaired as a matter of law. In the case of alcohol, that line is 0.08 BAC, or blood alcohol concentration. And an important part of our story is that 0.08 BAC really was found through careful research that took place over many, many years and was ultimately adopted as the standard by the federal government. All right, well, let's get back to marijuana here. So what happened was, when the legalization campaign started to rev up, law enforcement said, well, there's going to be all this awful stuff happening, apocalypse on the highway. And so we need to have tools like we have with alcohol, so that we'll be able to tell who's impaired and who isn't. So during the marijuana legalization campaigns in Washington and in Colorado leading up to the vote in 2012, there was more and more pressure that was building on this issue. And in Washington, supporters behind that legalization measure responded, and they took the alcohol DUI per se model and they tried to sort of fit marijuana into that. And so rather than a 0.08 BAC, they drew the line at how much THC could appear in a person's bloodstream before they could be considered impaired. And that line was drawn at 5 nanograms per milliliter. Well, the folks in Washington didn't innovate this approach. There were already states that were jerry-rigging their per se laws that were for alcohol to try to fit THC, and those states were setting the limit even lower at 2 nanograms per milliliter. So when this issue came up in Washington, supporters saw 5 nanograms as something like a compromise. Well, it turns out it doesn't matter where you draw that line, whether it's 2 or 5 nanograms or even higher. The problem is that alcohol is unique in the respect that if you can find it in a person's bloodstream, it's probably affecting them in the head in some way. Other drugs, including pharmaceuticals, just don't work that way, and certainly marijuana doesn't work that way. Well, not only does the presence of THC tell us nothing about how impaired a person is or whether they're impaired at all, THC actually lasts a really long time in a person's bloodstream. A person can have THC in their system a week or even more after they've consumed. And in the case of a medical cannabis patient where they're regular consumers, they're very likely going to have THC in their system all the time, whether or not it affects their ability to actually drive. So you could have a person who consumes one day and 2 days later they get pulled over and they're given the test and law enforcement thinks they're impaired. Unfortunately, other states picked up on that 5 nanogram per milliliter, thought that that's the way to go, and included it in their laws. Well, there's an even worse DUI law out there, if you can believe it, and that's called zero tolerance DUI. And what it does is it says that if any amount of THC can be detected in a person's bloodstream, that's enough to call them impaired as a matter of law. Obviously, that's not a fair situation, and it kind of feels at that point that it's really more about lifestyle choices than it is about actual impairment. And so while marijuana is very popular and law enforcement very much wants to have new tools in order to detect impaired driving, you can't really retrofit the science and expect that to work. Well, I am happy to report that activists and advocates that have been involved in this situation, they have seen this problem and have been working for years to try to turn this back around. And it looks like states are not really continuing to adopt this terrible law. But in the meantime, this law is on the books in quite a few states. Here's the list of states that currently have per se DUI laws related to marijuana, and here's the list of states that have zero tolerance DUI laws on the books. Well, we're going to continue to have law enforcement asking for ways to be able to apply per se type standards. There are going to be technology companies trying to come up with different types of breathalyzer tech, but really the solution is to treat marijuana like we treat every single other drug, which is to use the first kind of DUI I mentioned, the one based on impairment, because that's where it belongs. All right, well, if you learned something today or if you liked my video, could you do me a huge favor and hit the like button? And if you want to keep up with my content, click subscribe. All right, folks, thanks again. See you next time.